Thanks, Hans. That was a really interesting opener to, I think, a conversation that's happening across the Atlantic. The US and the EU right now are thinking about what is the role in merger control in the context of broader policy initiatives. And in Europe specifically, Draghi has become a household name, and in the last couple of years, there's been a lot of pressure in terms of how do you realize some of the objectives that he pointed out in that report, focusing on growth, innovation, and the climate initiatives and scale. And so from your perspective, and thinking back to the keynote address, focusing on bringing this back down, humility within the legal space, as an economist, how do you give meat to that abstract considerations?
Yeah, I mean, and of course it's always a delicate debate when you try to place a policy tool that has clear boundaries within these sort of larger frameworks and make it deliver in that way. I think the Draghi report was very important for Europe because it pointed the finger to structural problems that there are, and to find ways of raising these problems to a way where they can be addressed in a more direct way. So obviously, one of the key problems that Europe has, simply because of its history, is that we have a very fragmented market. We're 27 member states with almost as many languages and with a history of very different regulations. And obviously, the countries are proud and of where they come from, and but that creates hurdles in the internal market that are especially big when here we're in a sort of tech environment when we're talking about capital markets, for example. Obviously, the fact that Europe doesn't have an integrated capital market is a major problem for attracting funding, and therefore also for having firms that innovate, because there's so strong incentives for tech startups to move to the US as quickly as possible. So, in a sense, Europe is larger in terms of population than the US by quite a bit. So, but it's not more important, if you will, in terms of its economic or political influence. So, in a sense, I think we're punching below our weight, and so it's important politically to address these problems, and merger control. Competition policy generally is one way, of helping there. At the same time, also, I think, merger control is competition law only, and so we are opening the merger guidelines, not the merger regulation. So the merger regulation is basically the legal text that says what merger control is and is not allowed to do. So at the end of the day, I think it's very clear that the focus of whatever we do will be one on competition, and we're not trying to turn competition law into sort of a public interest test that tries to address all the issues that are there in a market. So at the same time, we don't live on an island. Yeah. So competition policy takes place in a framework where markets are driven by issues of global competitiveness, of sustainability, of resilience. So obviously, these are super important factors to take into account in the way that decisions are looked at. But as I said, these guidelines, they will not be guidelines that replace what is essentially a competition standard with one that would be a public interest standard.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on a really important point, that as competition lawyers, we look to the tools that are available to us and we think, what does this mean for merger control? But there is, of course, the focus on capital investment, talent flight, et cetera. And so from your perspective, and thinking about this constant refrain of European champions, and is this possible, what can we do? Is this a place for merger control? What do you think can be done to support this, and how do you go about doing it?
Yeah, I mean, European Champions, of course, is very high on the wish list of some large European companies. But and it's important for us, of course, to listen to companies, and part of the public consultation that we're going to have is precisely also to get the view of the business side. At the same time, also we have to be careful not to ask the hairdresser whether we need a haircut. And European Champions, well. So, to the extent that that there are large European companies who want to merge, and these mergers, either don't create any significant competition problems in the first place, or those competition problems are minor compared to the complementarities and efficiencies in terms of gaining scale and becoming more competitive. So if that's the case, we're obviously all for it on a competition standard. At the same time, I would also caution that in this discussion about European champions, great companies are not built by politicians sitting around a table and putting together European champions, much as that would please some politicians. We're here in San Francisco, and the great companies in tech, they were built bottom up and not top down. So I have a certain caution about, going far beyond competition policy, by the way, but really about the approach to a market economy. Obviously, given that we have this market fragmentation, there is certainly things where politics can help in bridging these boundaries that we currently have in the market, and that may well include in isolated cases large merger cross-border. But at the same time, I do think the main benefit that politics can have for European competitiveness, that's in things like lowering those barriers to trade, cutting red tape, making sure that we have an investment-friendly climate in Europe, and creating a public system that's conducive to investment and to education, and with the right mindset, also an industrial policy that that can help European firms to grow and compete. The European champions, we will take them as they come.
Fair enough. It's impossible to have a conversation in any legal forum these days without reaching AI. And thinking about the topic of resiliency and digital sovereignty, there's a lot of pressure to not become over-dependent or let the markets tip and have European trying to post-regulate. And so, from your perspective, what is DG Comp most focused on in sorting out the issues that could arise throughout the AI stack? Are there specific theories of harm that you're really focused on, bottlenecks that could impede entry? What are you focused on? Okay, so
first of all, I think what's important from my personal perspective about AI is that merger control is perhaps not the very first thing that comes to my mind when I look at the policy implications of AI. It's much more what an incredible revolution it is, and how much it changes many markets. How many markets have been disrupted already by it, and we're clearly only at the beginning. So in terms of the societal impacts that it has, clearly this being such a dramatic change, there will be lots of stuff to worry about, and there is obviously a large discussion about some of those things. For example, about who will still produce content when content is essentially recycled and produced to consumers in a manageable form, where nobody has to go anymore to the original content creator. And so there's lots of issues that are very interesting. In terms of competition, I think what's astonishing is that a couple of years into this revolution, we still have an extraordinarily competitive field with 3 real behemoths who are really well financed, with OpenAI, with Anthropic, with Google, and then sort of a second tier of at least half a dozen of companies, which include some of the tech superstars, and we have such a rapid pace of innovation. We have consumer prices that are far below cost, and we have investments that are incredible. And so for the time being, other than has been predicted in some antitrust conferences a couple of years back, this is still a very competitive market. And so I think if people have a concern about the competition in this market, perhaps at the moment it's less that there is no competition, and it's more about how will companies like OpenAI actually be able to monetize this, given the pace of the investments that are necessary to stay ahead in this race. And so I think there are a couple of economic features why these markets have not taken the road of some of the platform markets, which often flipped very quickly when one company was the best. And one reason for this is that the network effects in this industry tend to be still relatively small. I mean, they're not zero, but it's not the same thing as on Instagram. When Corey, you were speaking before, that if all my friends are on Instagram, where am I going to go? I'm not going to go to Hansi's Picture Exchange. So that feature, is not there. The second thing is that in the platform markets, you have enormous economies of scale. That's why there are such nice business models for investors, that you have the fixed cost and the costs hardly change if you add additional users. And that's really not the case with AI, obviously, given that the marginal cost of you're burning tokens. So there's a lot of marginal cost. So it just doesn't scale as nicely as the platform markets. Then one other thing is that advertising doesn't work as well. You have a situation where the platform models, they were in one way or other all financed by advertising, and as Corey explained in the previous panel, that has worked quite well for the platform owners. But if I go on and search on a chatbot for something, I'm not really interested in the original source. So some of those firms have committed not to use advertising at all. Others have started and are kind of pulling back. And then the final one, I think, is that the IP protection is really bad in AI, in the sense that distillation is so easy. So the ability of others essentially to capture the essence of a trained model by just bombarding it with tens of thousands of questions, and then not having to go through the process of training their own model, but at the end of the day, sort of capturing the essence of that model simply by by that process of asking questions. And that's probably the explanation why some of the Chinese competitors, despite the fact that they have limited access to GPUs, they're not light years behind. They're a couple of months behind. And so even small companies like Mistral in Europe, in the beginning, everybody was saying, well, they're obviously going to die because they have nowhere the funding and nothing of the sort. And Mistral is growing. Of course, I'm not saying they will compete with OpenAI. Obviously, they will not. But they have their following in Europe by people who want a sovereign AI, and they will thrive on that. And as long as they're only a couple of months behind, so what I'm trying to say is that you don't have the same characteristics of a tendency to monopolization that you have in other markets. Now, of course, we're in early stage. So at the moment, we don't know yet how monetization will look like. And there will certainly have to be lots of changes in terms of, what people are paying and, what different tiers there are and so forth and so forth. And so, this is early days. So we're obviously monitoring this very much. But I think with whatever theory of harm you want to apply to it, at least in non-horizontal mergers, obviously you would need some sort of dominance somewhere for all that to apply, and at the moment I don't see that. Now you have certain stages related to these markets where you have it. So let's say NVIDIA with GPUs, I mean obviously they're more than dominant, so you know, the direct issues are more there. I'm not saying that there cannot be problems in AI markets, so I don't know, you know, XAI announced that they're gonna buy Cursor a few days ago. Now if that was not XAI, but it was Anthropic, you know, who are leading in the software coding part. You know, there you would wonder, well, why do they actually need Cursor, or aren't they just buying it so nobody else gets it and makes their AI better? So you know, obviously there can be issues on these horizontal parts, and in the future there can also be issues on vertical and conglomerate. But I would see the risk lower than in the platform markets that were there in the past.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've highlighted a few really critical things, that these markets are fundamentally different. They're not the same as platforms. The same types of constraints and you know, things like network effects may not be as present. We haven't seen the full, you know, how they'll be monetized. And so I'm really curious how the merger guidelines will come into all of this, and how do you anticipate, you know, what enforcement should look like and provide sufficient guidance to navigate this sort of unsettled landscape at the moment?
Yeah. So look, I mean, so the draft is not out, so I cannot say everything, of course. But from a general perspective, I think one thing that we're trying to change, and that will be a big part of it, is to take a generally more dynamic perspective on competition law, and that's something that doesn't only apply to tech, but you know, really also applies to normal industries. So is you know, is not seeing markets as something which is you know, sort of a collection of little antitrust markets where people compete on price, given how the world is today, but to view economies more as, you know, dynamic organisms that morph in some industries more than others, obviously. But you know, to give an example, I was mentioning airlines before, and you know, airlines is a pretty old school industry, and it, you know, doesn't change all that much. But if you look at airlines as a collection of little routes where you know, prices are changed, then you cannot you know, evaluate a merger in airline markets well enough, because airlines are network markets. Airlines change where they operate, how they operate. If you have in Europe, you have a very large number of firms coming from the fact that there were local national carriers, and so there's a lot of consolidation. There will be more consolidation, and if two of those firms go together, you know, if you view that just as a collection of routes, you're missing the fact that you know, if there's two network carriers, they have feeder traffic, they have access to other markets, and so forth. So you know, the way you know, Lufthansa thinks about its competitive strategy is not looking at Toulouse, Frankfurt individually, but looking at the entire network and how they can evolve that network in the future, given the competition they face. And so that's the view that we have to take. And you know, for tech markets specifically, I think you know, I mean, I think one of the mistakes of competition law when the tech platforms started was to take a too static view in terms of, you know, all these guys are competing and these guys are complements, without, I think, recognizing enough that in fast-changing markets, what's a complement today may very quickly turn into a substitute tomorrow. Because precisely in those markets where you have a monopolist incumbent, the situation that you have is very often that, you know, because of the kill zone, as it's often called, it's very, very tough for competitors to, you know, just start with the same product and say like, oh, I'll build the next Google and just do more or less the same thing. So that's not going to be a very successful business strategy. So what you do very often is create something that's outside that kill zone, that is maybe complementary or at least very differentiated from what the big platform does. And then, you know, once you're outside that center of gravity, what you can do is you build your own network effects in your own scale, and that gives you the strength to then go down the value chain. And so in that sense, you know, looking at these markets as something that is pure complements or pure substitutes is a mistake. I think it has led to a too permissive merger control in certain situations, and and that's a perspective that we try to change. While at the same time, I think pretty much the same can be said about potential benefits from mergers, sort of the ability of competition authorities to recognize that that mergers can be something that greatly enhance the competition in certain cases.
Yep. I'm going to put my practitioner hat on for a second, and you highlighted that it's an important aspect of competition to go beyond what already exists and not just be the next Google. And in terms of making that argument and showcasing this new innovative product, how do you go about doing that in the merger control context? What are the pro-innovation arguments that should be given weight, and how do you balance that against potential harms?
Yeah. So. One thing we're going to do is we're going to explicitly, go towards a situation where let's take a more long-term view. Also on the realization of efficiencies. From my personal perspective, the most convincing efficiencies ultimately are those where you have strong complementarities. So that could be technological complementarities or adding markets either in geographic or in product terms, or where you have internal synergies where the merger can help. And ultimately this is about identifying a market failure, if you will. If you say this merger is good, then the question is, okay, so what's stopping you from doing this before the merger? And I think there, when we're talking about scale, which is the big word sort of thrown around a lot, scale in itself, we don't view it as either something good or bad intrinsically. So being big is neither the theory of harm nor it's an efficiency in itself. It can be both, but if we're talking about an efficiency, I think the important thing is, just to explain in very concrete terms what this merger allows you to do that you couldn't do before. Which markets can I address, or which technologies can I create, and so forth, that I can't do without, or that I could do without, but only at substantially larger cost. And time consumed, and so I think that's the key point. It's not about just scale at any cost. If you're the number one sausage company and you're buying the number two sausage company in the country, and you're saying, well, I can scale better and I'll save 2% in procurement cost. I mean, that's probably not the type of scale that will get us very excited about efficiencies.
Sure. So I think we're coming up on time. So my final question will be about the evidence. How do you make the case? And we heard earlier reference to the infamous Instagram email. In your view, is it the ordinary course documents that really pull weight? Do they sort of expose the dynamics that you referenced earlier, or is it traditional metrics and economic models that really can be illuminated here?
Look, I mean, it's interesting because I'm old enough to remember the time when at the EU we hardly had any internal documents at all in the merger review. So at the beginning, we just had sort of, extremely limited internal documents, and at the time, obviously, we were focusing on what we could focus on, which is sort of external information and, as you say, economic evidence of what who's competing with whom and what are the margins, what are the diversion ratios, and so forth and so forth. And then when you raise the theory of harm, usually the answer that you would get from counsel of the company is to say, that's all very theoretical, the models that you're doing. And if you saw the emails that I'm seeing, you would understand how the business is really thinking about this. You bureaucrats, you're in your world where you put these numbers together, but that's really not the reality and how these markets really work out. And then we started introducing internal documents to a much larger degree, and I think now what I hear much more often, I had it on a conference not so long ago where a lawyer said, like, look, I mean, this weight that you put to internal documents, that really doesn't make any sense, and it's the typical thing is like, these are just, these are just the tech bros sort of fantasizing about how they will rule the world. It doesn't have anything to do with the market reality, and you should really go, and look at the hard facts, at the evidence and the economic models and so forth. And so I think at the end of the day, ideally you want to have both. And in tech markets, I think internal documents play a much larger role than in other markets because a lot of things are about changes in the future that you cannot read necessarily out of the market developments or the static market situation in the moment. So clearly they place greater weight. I think, if you have the sausage manufacturers going together and you have the right ingredients, you have high margins, high market shares, diversion between the companies. I don't think we need to see many internal documents in order to say something about that merger. Whereas in tech mergers, I think both for the theories of harm and for the theories of benefit, the internal documents clearly play a big role.
Well, thank you very much, and we will all keep internal documents front of mind and advising on the next merger.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.